Okay, one more time for folks who have just popped in. There's the handout in the chat. You can give yourselves a little stretch. I'm glad you're all here. This is kind of exciting. I like taking the time on to go through this this topic in particular. So here's how I'm going to proceed. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll start by sharing a little bit about myself and what we're doing tonight, and I'll invite you folks to introduce yourselves in the chat. It's kind of neat to see who's here, and maybe you want to, I don't know, say where you're calling in from tonight or whatever. If it works for you to keep your video on, please feel welcome to. I do like seeing people's faces while I'm chatting. It kind of helps me feel a little more present and in the room. And if you are not able to or prefer not to, that's completely fine. I'm glad you're here. Just gonna share my screen now. Hey, Rachel from Sudbury, Ontario. Thanks, Rachel. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Here we go. So, thought challenging. Welcome to the webinar for tonight. Our topic is one that I am becoming more and more fond of as time goes on. It wasn't one that we originally covered as much when we were just starting out the program. As I was finishing my master's, I started this program, which is the origins of what you see here, on mental health wilderness first aid, and we focused a lot on things like empathy and active listening and mindfulness activities and how breathing regulates the nervous system and our nervous system's responses to stress and how it tries to protect us. All really good things. We didn't focus as much on the rational tools to complement those emotional mind tools. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and why I've become more aware of how important that is as time goes on. But let me start or restart by introducing myself a little more. So I'm Daye Hagel. I'm the director and the founder of an organization called Mental Health Wilderness First Aid. We offer mental health first aid training, which is especially oriented to folks who live, work, or play out in wilderness or remote areas. So we have a lot of fun folks who come through our program, a lot of wilderness guides and search and rescue and remote area oil rig workers and tree planters, First Nations, all kinds of great folks come through our program. Most of my background, I should say first that I'm a wife and a mother. I have 3 little boys, and they're all under 4.5 right now. So that is really keeping me busy. And I'm also a clinical counselor, and I also have had quite a career as a wilderness guide, mostly as a CCAT guide out here on the West Coast. I'm in southwestern coastal British Columbia to orient myself as well. Most of what I did was kayak guiding and things kind of peripheral to that. So training other guides, training other wilderness leaders, some like longer term remote area expedition work. And then at one point I went back to school and became a clinical counselor. So I have a master's in clinical counseling, and I am a Canadian certified counselor with the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. And one of the many areas that I have had a little bit of clinical training in is in something called Cognitive Behaviour Therapy, which I'll go through later tonight, but it's where we get the idea of thought challenging from. So I'll introduce all of that as time goes on. Here's a scenario for us to chew on as we go through. Now, this is not on your handout, so let's just see if we can start thinking about this. Could someone read our scenario of Jean tonight? You folks know that I talk a lot if you've been to any of the other webinars, so sometimes I like to throw a ball to someone else. Who'd like to read Jean out loud? Rachel, go right ahead.
I can read it. Okay, Jean. Jean tells you she is looking forward to being out in the field, but she sometimes feels worried that something bad will happen to her family, like a car accident, while she's away, even though there is no specific reason to be concerned. Sometimes her mind starts spinning and she can't stop thinking about them or the what ifs, and she may even feel like she can't breathe. I can't stop thinking that it must just mean something bad is going to happen if I leave. Also, everyone else in the field is going to think that I'm crazy. As she is talking, you notice Jean avoids eye contact and her hands are trembling slightly.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so we'll chew on Jean a little bit as time goes on. Let me introduce what we're going to be going through tonight, and then we'll return to think about Jean in conjunction with some of these other things. So tonight, my agenda is we're going to talk about so thought challenging is a rational tool. So we're going to talk about where do rational tools fit into offering mental health first aid kind of support. When is an appropriate time to lean into rational tools? When is an inappropriate time to bring in a rational tool? And when is a time when it might be, you might do harm by not bringing in a rational tool. Okay, so we'll talk briefly about all those things. I'm going to introduce you folks to a field of therapy called Cognitive Behaviour Therapy or Cognitive Behavioural Therapy or CBT. And there's something called a CBT triangle, which we're going to get into tonight and see how that fits into this thought challenging piece. And of course, we'll spend the bulk of our time on actually thought challenging, which will include cognitive distortions. It might include some healthy alternative thoughts. Will include challenging, thought spirals when they come up, or thoughts when they're out of proportion to reality in a way that is not helpful to us. Perhaps like what's going on for our friend Jean. Here's my always note. This is an experiential workshop, so everything that we're offering is optional and invitational. I will at some points invite you to go into breakout rooms and to try things out or to work through parts of the worksheet together. That's an invitation. If you need to opt out of that for any reason, just know that you don't owe me an explanation. It does help if you drop a note for me in the chat, and I'll do my best to keep you out of a room and make the rooms make sense. So thanks for your patience with that. That being said, yeah, if you can't go into a room, no problem. You're welcome to stay here. Just understand that there will be some, periods of silence. And as long as you're okay with just waiting for folks to come back out of breakout rooms, then I'm pleased to have you here. I'm delighted. There's a Canada-US wide support line, which is 988, if anyone feels like they are would benefit from some support, and you're welcome to chat with me as well. Okay, so let's look at where rational tools fit into the overall framework that we use for mental health first aid. So I'll introduce you first of all, if you haven't taken a mental health wellness first aid course, this is the structure and the outline that we use in the course. So this is part of our field notes page. It looks like there's a lot of info on our page. I'm just going to point out a couple of brief things if you're not familiar with this already. So we always talk about relationship is the foundation of everything else that we do in the mental health support world, right? So there's this little line actually on our form that comes from relationship, and it actually intersects all the other steps that we do in mental health wellness first aid. And that's just a reminder that if we get stuck, we can always go back to the idea of relationship. Okay, this isn't really working what I thought I was doing. How can I just be in relationship with this person right now? How can I regulate myself? Hopefully the other person's nervous system will co-regulate with mine. That's a really good fundamental intervention. We talk about active listening a lot. We talk about connection as a correction a lot. So if we ever get stuck, or if we get into the rational tools and the rational tools aren't landing, I would say, let's drop them, right? And if the rational tools aren't landing, rational tools are all the way a bit down here, by the way, we call them wizard brain interventions. If they're not landing, and if thought challenging, like we might try tonight, isn't landing for any reason, I would say just let go of it and let's not have an ego about it, and let's go back to relationship. Now in the course, and as you can see reflected in this outline, mental health wellness first aid mirrors medical first aid. So for instance, if we're coming on scene for medical first aid, the first thing we're going to do is what we call a primary survey, right? So someone's been injured or hurt, or we're not quite sure what's going on. The first thing we're going to do is take care of safety and stabilization. That's our primary survey. So for medical first aid, that would probably look like, let's do a quick scene survey, right? Any danger to myself or others, or continued danger to the person. We might do check the mechanism of injury, right? What happened here? Some ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation, rapid body survey, stabilize, protect from shock, that kind of thing, right? Safety and stabilization. Okay. Once we have that, then medical first aid, we can move into things that are more nitty gritty. Let's take a history, let's make a plan, let's assess more carefully this injury, whatever it is, right? We don't want to get distracted by assessing the injury too carefully before we have safety and stabilization in place, okay? So same kind of structure is true for mental health first aid. So mental health first aid is we're coming on scene, What's our primary survey? So what are the things in safety and stabilization we want to pay attention to right away so that we don't get distracted by information, problem solving, advice giving, that kind of thing, right? So for mental health first aid, we have a set of ABCs. It's very similar to medical first aid, but it's basically, hey, let's do a quick scene survey, any actual danger. B in our ABC stands for brain, meaning how escalated is this person in their nervous system? And we call this lizard brain or wizard brain, or somewhere in between, okay? And C is for medical conditions, meaning we don't want to miss medical first aid if it's needed. Let me go back to B for just a moment though. If somebody is escalated in their lizard brain or partial lizard brain, right? They're actively anxious, they're actively angry, that kind of thing. What we point out is that people who are actively escalated in their nervous system, right? They are what we would call in their lizard brain, or they're in their survival brain. There's some kind of a fight, flight, freeze reaction going on, and it's probably there to protect the person. And so we want to just honor where the person's at right now. But also, is this a good time to get into rational, logical problem solving and thinking? Maybe not, right? So what we want to do before we get into those kinds of things is we want to recognize, hey, this person's in their lizard brain or partly anxious or whatever. The first thing we want to do is just help regulate the nervous system. So regulate my nervous system as a good starting place. Okay. And then we also want to regulate the other person's nervous system. And regulating my own nervous system is a good way to do that because people will co-regulate with you. But we also talk about the importance in the class of looking at what we call lizard brain interventions, which are the things that people who have a background in working with people or supporting people or youth work or anything, people who are caring people, often have a decent amount of skills built up in the lizard brain interventions area. You might not call it that, but you might have, for instance, some deep breathing tools in your back pocket. You might have some mindfulness or meditation tools in your back pocket. Or maybe you'd go for a walk with, let's just go back for a sec. Maybe you'd go for a walk with Jean, right? Would you go for a walk with Jean, or would you do some deep breathing, or would you do just some sitting and listening to her, right? So those are all good things that are going to help regulate and help build some relationship. Now, and let me go back for a moment, because if the only tools in your back pocket are empathy and protecting the person and trying to reduce the anxiety by protecting the person, saying, okay, you don't need to go into the field, Jean, we'll just go back and talk to your family, or hey, you can talk to your family every night if you want. It's possible that that's going to get us into a little bit of trouble in the long run. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you here to a concept called the wise mind. Now again, if you've taken a course with us, this might be familiar to you. We build our course around the idea of the wise mind, and the wise mind says that there's basically two parts of our mind. We have an emotional mind and a rational mind. And we get into trouble if we're unbalanced in either direction, right? We get into trouble with our mental health if we're too rationally minded, meaning that we don't care about our feelings, or we're not paying attention to feelings, or we don't think our feelings matter, or we're suppressing our feelings. That's the Spock error, right? Obviously that gets us into trouble. And perhaps that was the classic problem, or the classic presentation for a long time in society, is that perhaps we were a little too rationally minded and we weren't paying enough attention or honoring people's anxieties, people's trauma, injuries, whatever that is, right? What the wise mind model says is that you can also get into trouble if you're overbalanced in the direction of the emotional mind. And what that could look like is that, like I said before, the only tools in your toolkit are empathy and regulation and sitting with someone and active listening, okay? That can get us into trouble if, for instance, somebody's anxiety is spiraling out of control. You know, and the person knows logically that the person's not in actual danger to the degree that they're responding to. And yet, rather than bring in the rational mind and try to challenge that in an appropriate way, you allow that to spiral and you allow the anxiety to take over and to become bigger than it actually is. That can also get us into trouble. So what the wise mind idea says is that we want to be aware of feelings. We want to honor them. Okay, I'm feeling anxious right now. I feel that because there's some tightness in my chest. Okay, and it's making me want to avoid the situation or lash out at this person. So there's my awareness, right? And then rather than letting that feeling take over, I want to bring in my rational mind and I want to ask, okay, I'm conscious of this now, so that's partially my rational wizard brain. And now what do I want to do with this feeling, right? Do I want to avoid the situation, or do I want to confront this person, or do I want to take a deep breath and remember that, oh, this isn't actually about this, it's because of this other thing. So that's what we call the wise mind synthesis, right? Is bringing in the emotional mind support and the rational mind support at the appropriate times for each. Okay, so if Jean's actively anxious right now, is it the right time for me to jump in and start asking her a bunch of questions or challenging her thoughts? Perhaps not, right? Perhaps I'm going to postpone that. But by the same token, if the only tools in my tool belt are I'm sitting with Jean and saying, yeah, gee, that is really scary, what might happen to your family, and tell me more about how bad that could be, and tell me more about how anxious you are, right? And yeah, maybe you should just go home and never leave your house again, right? Now, that might be with the best of intentions that I'm being that empathetic, but is it possible that that's actually going to make it worse over time? Okay, so that's where this fits into our overall structure. So I just want to recognize that we're jumping ahead tonight. We're jumping right ahead to the wizard brain interventions, but when we really look at this in the context of the whole structure that we teach, where we would use this skill would be quite late in the process, right? We want to make sure before we pull in anything rational, logical, and like challenging the person, we want to make sure we have some relationship built. We want to make sure that we have safety and stabilization, regulation in the nervous system. In the class, we also talk about asking some more questions to get a bigger picture of what's been going on for this person, right? So we're not just jumping in with this solution or challenge too quickly. And then in the class, I'm also going to point out that we also talk about stages of change, aka we go through this whole lesson about stages of change, but this boils down to the question, is this person interested in my help or interested in my intervention? And that's a good question to ask, because not everybody who could benefit from thought challenging would be interested in thought challenging. And we just want to honor where the person's at, right? So the right time for a wizard brain intervention is after you have relationship built, after you have regulation, after you have a bigger picture of what's going on for this person, and you have a sense of this person's interested in this idea that I have. Okay, and then is a great time to pull in the wizard brain interventions. I'll add one more thing about how this can be helpful. That's that. So the emotional mind tools, right? The things like building relationship, taking a deep breath, regulation, mindfulness, all that kind of stuff. Those things are really good at helping people reduce their anxiety in the short term, right? If those are the only tools in my toolkit, it's possible that over time, we might accidentally actually increase the anxiety in the long term, right? And where we would like to go in the long term is if we would like to not just regulate anxiety in the moment, but actually have less anxiety over time going forward. If the goal is to retrain the lizard like that, then we have to bring in the rational mind tools, right? So in order to actually retrain our survival threat-based responses, we have to bring in the rational mind, and we have to be willing to challenge the lizard and not just to make the lizard feel better in the moment. Okay, so all of that to say, here are the different, what we call wizard brain interventions that we teach in the course. So again, this is all when the person's regulated, you have a relationship and the person's interested, right? Here's some more rational things that we can offer. The first thing we can offer is psychoeducation, which I'll talk briefly about in a moment, but it's basically telling the person a little bit about how the brain and the nervous system work and how your threat response tries to protect you. Okay. Thought challenging is what we'll spend our time on tonight. In the course, we also talk about behavior challenging, which is the B of CBT. And we won't get too much into that tonight. And last but not least, we talk about field support planning, which is just making a written plan for how to support this person going forward, right? The whole point of this course is wilderness or remote area. So we look at how can this person be supported in the field, whatever the field is. So let's look at psychoeducation. And as we go through this, then at one point, fairly soon, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms and you have a chance to try this, okay? So psychoeducation is once the person's regulated and interested in your help, right? Then, hey, Jean, I hear that you're really worried about your family, and you kind of get into this thought spiral of anxiety over them, and you kind of feel trembly and you have a stomach ache and that kind of thing. And that sounds really tough. And I'm just wondering, now that we've been talking for a while, can I tell you a little bit about how the brain works under stress and how it tries to protect us, right? So, Jean, the thing that I really like about the brain is that I always keep in mind that the brain is my friend, right? It's my good friend, and it's trying to protect me, whatever the situation is, right? And we essentially have two parts of our brain. We have a survival-based unconscious brain, which is back here, and I call that the lizard brain. The lizard brain, all vertebrate animals have a lizard brain, right? The lizard brain's job is to keep you alive, and so it runs your body for you, and it looks out for threat. And if it thinks there's threat, then the way it runs my body for me is in what we call fight, flight, freeze mode, right? Have you heard of that, Jean? Yeah. So fight, flight, freeze mode is things like it takes energy away from non-essential things in order to try to protect you and help you survive. So what the lizard brain thinks is non-essential if there's a threat is it does things like shut down our digestive system, either a bit or a lot, in order to put energy towards other things like my heart beating faster, or my stress hormones, or my sweaty palms, or being able to run, whatever it is, right? The other thing that the lizard thinks is non-essential if I'm under threat, it thinks what we call the wizard brain is non-essential. So your wizard brain is kind of the opposite of the lizard, right? The wizard brain is the conscious brain, and it's the rational brain. And so it's the part of the brain that kind of knows if something is logical or rational or reasonable. It makes decisions and processes complex information, that kind of thing, right? And so that's another part of the brain that the lizard will start to shut down if it feels like there's some kind of threat response. And so it totally makes sense to me, Jean, how you might feel this anxiety come on and you can't control it, even though you know rationally that there's no particular reason to be concerned about your family. It's still like a feeling that comes on for you that you don't have a lot of control over. You're getting all shaky and that kind of thing. It also doesn't surprise me necessarily that you have a stomach ache sometimes when that happens, right? So you can give people very basic information about their brain and their nervous system. And the cool things about psychoeducation are it's very evidence-based, that just by having a little bit of information about the brain and the nervous system, that in and of itself can help reduce people's anxiety. Okay, so it's a great thing to do to give information. And here's another thing we could add to our psychoeducation. Okay, so in the course we spend more time on this and people get more chances to go through it, but I will throw you into a breakout room and you can talk about this with each other for a moment. Okay, there's one more thing I'm going to add to psychoeducation, which is the question of, okay, how do I train my lizard, right? Okay, I get it, Daye, the brain's my friend, my lizard's trying to protect me. It makes sense that I have a stomach ache and, I'm not consciously, rationally in charge of what my brain's doing when I feel stressed, even if it's not logical. So I get it. But also, how do I train the lizard to have less of a response, right? Okay, great, you're trying to protect me, but this isn't actually helpful to me, lizard, right? So here's what I'll say about that. There's something called cognitive behavioral therapy. Who's heard of CBT before? Anybody? Oh, great. Okay, a few people, but not everybody. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a very rational, logical form of therapy. And as you can tell from the title of cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive is thought-based, right? And behavioral is action-based. And therapy is how do we use our thoughts and our behaviors in kind of conscious, intentional, practiced ways to improve our mental health. So there's different, because it's such a rational, logical form of therapy, it's very evidence-based for one, so extremely efficacious, turns out, or it does really well in things, in clinical trials, right? Cognitive behavior therapy will do really well in clinical trials for things like anxiety or anxiety disorders, depression, that kind of thing. Because it's so rational, logical, you can get fun kind of workbooks in CBT. I'm going to show you, this is a child and youth-based workbook, but it's very like, okay, let's think about step A and step B, and what about this? And so it's really it's helping you, to retrain your thoughts, so to become more aware of your thoughts, and then to retrain them if they're not helpful to you, or to become more aware of your behaviors and practice different behaviors if they're not helpful to you. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to this concept. It's a basic concept in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the CBT triangle. Okay, so the CBT triangle looks at how feelings and thoughts and behaviors are all interconnected. So I'll give you an example, right? If I have a feeling about something like anxiety, and we'll use an example that is true in my own life, I feel quite anxious when I'm up at a height, even if I know my wizard brain knows rationally that I'm safe. So I'm in a building or I'm in an elevator or I'm roped up to something, right? I'll still feel quite anxious. My heart will beat fast. I'll get sweaty palms. Oh, my breath will rise to the top of my chest, right? I won't be breathing diaphragmatically anymore. And my wizard brain will start getting down-regulated, okay? So those are feelings of anxiety about the situation of rock climbing. Now, what CBT says is that if I have feelings about something, then I probably have associated thoughts and associated behaviors. Okay, so I'll give you an example again. My associated thoughts when I'm rock climbing might be, this is dangerous, the rope is going to break, Rachel, who's belaying me, is not paying attention, I'm gonna fall and die, right? Those are my thoughts, okay? Thanks, Rachel, by the way. Now, if those are my feelings and those are my thoughts about rock climbing, then probably my natural behavior inclination is going to be to what relative to rock climbing? What am I going to want to do relative to rock climbing? I'm probably going to want to avoid it, right? That would, by the way, that's an example of a flight response. Even if it's not super obvious that that's a flight response, I'm avoiding the stimuli or the stimulus that makes me feel anxious. That's a flight response. Okay. So what CBT says is that these are all interconnected, and it's difficult for me to change my feelings directly, right? It's difficult for me to just like say, okay, well, I just won't be anxious when I rock climb. Great. Problem solved, right? That's hard for me to do. Feelings, by the way, are thought to be generated somewhere in your limbic system, which is that like inside back bottom area of your brain. It's part of your unconscious lizard brain. It's really hard for me to just decide consciously to change my feelings because they're generated by the subconscious part of my brain. But what CBT points out is that, okay, well, what I could do instead of trying to change my feelings directly is I could become more aware of my thoughts. And I could challenge my thoughts if they're not helpful to me. I could become more aware of my behaviors, and if my behavior natural inclination is to avoid a situation, and my goal is to retrain my lizard so that I have less anxiety over time, then I'm actually going to consciously, intentionally put myself more in the situation that I'm anxious about. And what CBT says is if over time we practice thought challenging and we practice behavior challenging, then over time what we're going to find is if we change our behaviors and change our thoughts, then our feelings will change. And that is the very evidence-based part, by the way, right? So if, for instance, we experience like chronic anxiety or chronic depression, then if we practice doing behaviors that we don't want to do, and we practice being aware of thoughts that are not helpful to us and consciously challenging our thoughts, then what we'll find is over time, the clinical depression, clinical anxiety could be alleviated. And it's something like, gosh, I don't remember the exact numbers and I don't want to make them up, but it is something like 10 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy with a trained cognitive behavioral therapist will outperform anti-anxiety medication, outperform antidepressant medication for most people in clinical trials, right? So it is very, very efficacious. And like I said, it's also something that because it's so rational logical, you can walk yourself through a workbook, and that can be fairly helpful as well, right? Okay, so breakout room number 1, I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm going to let you folks go into breakout rooms and just get to know each other a little bit. So say hi to each other. And then second thing that you could do in your breakout room is you could chat about this. You could chat about the idea of psychoeducation or the idea of the cognitive behavior therapy triangle. Are there any examples that came to mind as I was talking that might be interesting to look at through the triangle lens? Are there any times when you can imagine telling somebody about how their brain works, or even introducing somebody to this triangle, right? If you were working with someone like Jean, for instance, who was kind of thought spiraling out of control, could you imagine introducing the idea of the CBT triangle to her and saying, hey, this might not be, or this might be difficult to change, but this might be a way that I could help you start working on this. Okay. So just go chat about that for a few minutes, probably 6 or 7 minutes, not too long. Okay. Okay, welcome back. Most people went right up to the last moment, so that implies good conversations. Any thoughts, comments in the chat or out loud?
It's really interesting. Like you have a tendency to want to go to like the root of it, kind of trying to comprehend a bit, where does this come from? Um, and also, yeah, so, has this, what has worked before?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and you're thinking yourself through to what would become a field support plan, Rachel, right? Yeah, partly it would be, hey, what's worked before? When you do start to feel like this or kind of spirally or whatever, like let's just build on your existing strengths. Let's integrate some lizard brain interventions, all that kind of stuff. Great. Yep. Good. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to the basics of thought challenging as a tool, right? So this is the theory behind it, knowing that feelings, thoughts, and behaviors are all interlinked, and that CBT at least says that that's a pretty good way of thinking about things. So let's look more carefully at if we were going to be more aware of our thoughts, and then look at trying to challenge our thoughts. What could that look like? So here's step one with thought challenging. Now, this is kind of outlined on your sheet. It'll be the first sheet in the handout that I handed you. And actually, one or two of you just came in late, so I'm going to pop it in the chat one more time. So on your sheet, there's a brief outline of thought challenging on the first page, and on the second page is a worksheet that I'll give you a few minutes to work through in the breakout rooms together again. So the first step with thought challenging, and we'll have an example here we can look at together in a moment, is just to become more aware of my thoughts so that my thoughts are conscious to me, and then I have options about what I do with them, right? So what automatic thoughts, if I feel anxious about something, what automatic thoughts do I have or are occurring to me at the same time as this anxiety? Like, what story am I telling myself? So let's look at this picture together and we'll unpack it a little bit. So when you look at this picture, who feels a bit anxious when you look at this picture? I feel a bit anxious when I look at this picture. Okay. So if you don't feel, once in a while I have someone who's like, oh, I'm a caver. Like, that's no problem at all. I feel great about this. Okay. But often people feel a bit anxious when they look at this picture. So if you don't feel anxious, try to imagine that you feel anxious. Okay. So the first step is to just become more aware of my thoughts. Like, if you let yourself lean into the anxiety a little bit, you might be aware of, like, where do I feel at my body? My, like, chest gets just a little tighter. That's where it sits in my body. Okay, now what are my thoughts? What are my automatic thoughts? Or what story am I telling myself that's associated with the anxiety? Like, what's the worst case scenario here? Give me some examples.
I'm gonna die.
Okay, I'm gonna die. Great. Absolutely. Yep. What else? Thanks,
I'm
Lauren.
gonna get stuck.
I'm gonna get stuck. Sure. Yep. That hole looks awfully small. He's gonna get caught. He's gonna be down there forever. He's probably panicking. Those could be all thoughts that I have while I'm looking at this picture, right? So that's the story I'm telling myself. Okay, good. The first step with thought challenging is just becoming more aware of what thoughts I'm attaching to the situation. Okay, step two. Ready for step two? Step two is, are these thoughts true? or what is the probability that these thoughts are true? So now we're going to go back to the picture and we're going to look for evidence. And we're looking for evidence. We're going to be fair to ourselves. So we're looking for evidence for my thoughts, my automatic narrative that I'm running. And I'm also going to be willing to look for evidence against my thoughts. Now, this is where we really do need to want to get into this step before this step is going to work for us, right? So some situations when you really are anxious, it might be hard for you to lean into the step. Let's try it. Are these thoughts true? What is the probability that they're true? And then we're going to look for evidence for and against it, okay? So what evidence do you see either for or against the kind of catastrophic thoughts that we had earlier? He's gonna die, he's gonna get stuck, he's probably panicking, that hole's too small. This is a terrible idea. Thomas.
The hole does look very small, and he looks like he's struggling to get through.
The hole does look small. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Yeah. And it does look like, he's not just jumping through. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this would count as evidence or not, but the fact that we have heard of instances where people have been stuck, where there has been stories.
Yep.
This has happened?
Yes, there have. So this is good because we don't want to, there's such a thing as toxic positivity, right? And when we're engaging in something like thought challenging, if we're not careful and or if the person we're talking to is not really ready to get into thought challenging, it is possible for us to come across as toxically positive when what we're trying to do is look for the evidence against the thought, right? So it is reasonable to think about, okay, there's some evidence for this thought and there's some evidence perhaps against this thought. So fair enough, right? What other evidence do we see for or against the thought that this hole is too small?
I see a foot there. So, I mean, 4 is that someone is there with him right now, to help him or guide him in a certain way.
Sure. Good. Okay, so you see that there's someone else there, and you could draw your attention to that. Now, one of the things that we talked about last week when we talked about supporting young children was we had a lovely teaching from Fred Rogers or Mr. Rogers, which was about looking for the helpers and just directing our attention on who's helping or who could help, right? So you could look at that, Lisa, in a number of ways. You could look at that, and sometimes people are like, oh, well, there's a foot there. Okay, we don't know the whole context of what's going on here, but yeah, there's another person here. That's a pretty good piece of evidence to consider, right? So maybe the person came through the hole. The person's taking a picture. If this guy were to get stuck, I imagine that the photo taker would help him. And look, sometimes with CBT, the most helpful thing to do is not necessarily to talk yourself out of the catastrophic situation that you're imagining, but rather to figure out, okay, what's the probability? And if the worst case scenario were to happen, what would happen next, right? So sometimes it's not necessarily saying, Jean, nothing bad is ever going to happen to your family is going to be totally fine while you're gone, right? Because that's also not necessarily a given, right? Life is unpredictable, and like Jean knows that, and it's possible, like people do get stuck in caves sometimes. So if you really go through CBT is very like worksheet based, and because it's so rational logical, it'll talk you through things like, okay, in this situation that you're anxious about, right? What's the worst case scenario? And write that down. And what's the percent probability that it's going to happen? Okay, and you get to kind of self-judge as you're going through this worksheet. Okay, what's the best case scenario? Let's write that down. What's the percent probability that the best case scenario is happening? Okay, now let's come up with like 2 or 3 kind of in-between scenarios and what are their percent probabilities. Okay, and now CBT will tell you, go back to the worst case scenario. If that were to happen, what might happen next? and then you write those things down, right? What's the worst case scenario there? What's the best case scenario there? And you again unpack all the probabilities. So it really teaches you to kind of work your way through your thinking in a structured way that could be helpful. So great, we've drawn our attention to there's another person in this picture, and I might tell myself, you know, I'm going to pause actually before I keep talking through this. Anyone else notice anything else that might be evidence for or against the person getting stuck?
I'm wondering what time of day or night it is because of the lamps.
Oh, interesting. I think, Rachel, you might be interpreting this as more of like a surface dweller type thing, as opposed to like if this is deep underground, there might be no light at all down there. Yeah. But you might, okay, so you might be unpacking that as like, oh, well, if they're near the surface, then there would be other options, maybe is what you're thinking. Yeah, for sure.
There's more room to the person's right, so they could kind of scooch over possibly. So there's a way out there.
Yep. Yeah, I can see that. Like if I kind of turn my head, and I've had actual, you know, cavers be part of this class, and they're like, oh, that guy's got so much room, right? Like if you look at his shoulders relative to the size of it, yeah, it's a little squishy, but it's like he'll be totally fine, right? So part of it might depend on your experience and how you interpret the photo as well. But certainly I can see that, you know, his shoulders are kind of this wide, and I can see that there's extra room over here. And if I let myself consider evidence, I can imagine a different story, right? So it doesn't have to be that you're 100% committed to one or the other story. This is you're willing to be aware of your thoughts. Where are my thoughts coming from? What's the evidence for these thoughts? What's the evidence against these thoughts? Okay, what are going to be my thoughts going forward? So now I'm going to ask myself, okay, do I want to challenge or replace these thoughts? And what else is true or what else is possible? This is something I like to call sometimes a healthy alternative thought, or a hat. Okay, I'm going to put my hat on. So a healthy alternative thought, again, we want to be careful that we don't get into toxic positivity, because toxic positivity is also a form of a distorted thought, and it also tends to push people away, right? It's not great for the relationship. It puts rifts in the relationship. Let's think about Jean for a moment, actually, when we think about a healthy alternative thought. If you folks don't have Jean right in front of you, so I'm just going to share my screen again. If I think about Jean, and I think, what's something toxically positive I could say to Jean? I think I gave you an example of this earlier, but play with me here.
I can jump in.
Mas.
Supposed to be toxically positive, I'd be like, oh, don't worry, nothing's gonna happen.
Sure. Yeah.
Even
Nothing.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, just denying it.
Sure, absolutely. Look on the bright side. You're going to have a great time. Nothing bad's going to happen. Okay, now there might be a time and a place for kind of distraction as well. For some people, that might be helpful. But generally, that kind of toxic positivity is not going to be helpful, and it's not going to land. It's also not very empathetic, right? Now, also, like I said earlier, it's also not necessarily helpful to Jean if you identify that she gets kind of in a... I'm going to back up for a sec. With somebody like Jean, right, I might be concerned, okay, is there any reason to think that your family might be in danger, right? So I do want to start from that place of figuring out, well, is there some reason for this? And sometimes people are feeling anxious because they have had a negative experience in the past, or there is a reason to be concerned. So I do want to have empathy for that, right? And just like we say in the scenario here, if sometimes there's just no specific reason to be concerned, but you know how you just can't break out of like a negative thought spiral of anxiety or of depression, right? So it's also not necessarily going to be helpful to Jean to just let her be in that spiral and over empathize with the spiral, right? So we're walking a line here between toxic positivity and toxic letting a person spiral when you know that's not helpful to them, right? So if I were instead to think about what's a healthy alternative thought that I might offer to Jean, right? I'm going to give an example that I've thought of for Jean, and then you folks can chime in and actually maybe I'll just put you in a breakout room for a moment. Maybe I'll just put you in a breakout room for a moment. Go talk about Jean. What's a healthy alternative thought that you might invite for Jean, or that you might work with Jean somehow? So same people, just so you can get to know each other over the course of the hour. Okay, welcome back. Very quick breakout room, I know. Any thoughts on a healthy alternative thought for Jean, or reframing perspective for Jean? I have an idea, but I want to hear if anyone else does first.
We kind of talked about maybe offering up before we leave on trip or whatever, that she could call her family and have a conversation and just confirm they're okay.
Sure. Yeah, that's possible. And that would become part of whatever kind of, if you were to make a field support plan for Jean, it might include check-ins at whatever interval seems to be appropriate, right? Now, if the interval that kind of spirally side of her wants is every 30 minutes, right? That might be an opportunity to think about, okay, is that actually going to be helpful, or is that potentially just going to reinforce the anxiety? That reassurance seeking is going to reinforce the anxiety. We didn't talk about this last week with young children, but we certainly could have, right? Children who are highly anxious or who have separation anxiety sometimes are reassurance seekers. And if we care about the children, right, we want to offer them reassurance, right? And sometimes what we're looking for in the medium to long term to actually help steer the child away from the anxiety rather than reinforce it is slightly less reassurance than the child is craving, if that makes sense. Right? So we're walking a balance between, we want to provide empathy and support, and we want to provide opportunities to check in and for that reassurance, and also we don't want to accidentally reinforce the need for the reassurance, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to offer a thought for Jean, and then I'll talk about cognitive distortions, because that's a really good thing to be aware of if you're not already. So Jean all the scenarios are based on real life, and I can certainly identify with where Jean is coming from, right? Sometimes even if there's no specific reason to be concerned about my young family or my kids, right? My thoughts are just kind of spirally. I found it helpful for myself to think nothing bad will happen to my children when my husband's got them out around town or on the highway or whatever, right? Not that nothing bad will ever happen, but I found it personally more helpful to think, okay, if my family were to get into trouble, my husband is smart and knows how to ask for help if he needs it. Or if I'm away for a conference and I'm worried about my family back home or something like that, my family's got good neighbors around who would step in to offer support if it were needed, right? So again, rather than thinking if something bad won't happen, it's going to the place of, what are my family's strengths? How can I put my focus on my family's strengths and the supports around them, and the idea of looking for the helpers, right? Or if something bad were to happen, what would happen next? People would help, right? So that's what's been helpful for healthy alternative thoughts for folks with that kind of anxiety, like Jean or like myself sometimes. So I want to introduce you to a skill of cognitive distortions before we break tonight. So I'll spend a few minutes on this, and then you'll go into breakout rooms again, and you can look at the worksheet on page 2. So the worksheet on page 2 invites you to think about different cognitive distortions, get practice just identifying them, and then you could start thinking about how you're going to challenge them. So page 1 is a list of cognitive distortions. Page 2 is a worksheet. If you do different CBT training sessions or workbooks or anything like that, they'll introduce you to the concept of cognitive distortions. This is actually what they're called, and I've just picked 8 that I think are the most interesting and relevant and kind of common. There's nothing magical about this set of 8. Sometimes you find like 12 cognitive distortions or 20 cognitive distortions in a list. So these are ones that I think are good to know about. So I'll walk you through a few of them, okay? Cognitive distortions are patterns of thought that are out of proportion to reality or to probability in a way that's not helpful. Okay, so example number 1 is emotional reasoning. So emotional reasoning is taking my feelings to imply something true about reality. So for instance, I feel anxious, therefore I must really be in danger. I feel depressed about my relationship, therefore my relationship is failing. I feel hurt by something that you said, therefore you said something wrong. You shouldn't have said that, right? Now, I always like to point out that any of those things could be true, but that's the work of thought challenging, is figuring out, okay, is that thought true? And if not, what else is behind it, or should I challenge it, right? So emotional reasoning, black and white thinking is sometimes called polarized thinking or opposites thinking. And this is just where it's easy to think of things in terms of all or never. You hear language like you always, or this never happens to me, or this never works out for me. Someone is either amazing or they're terrible. You hear this in politics a fair bit, right? From a lot of different places, right? You're either with us or against us, or you're one of those. That kind of thing, right? Having difficulty seeing shades of gray or nuance. Catastrophizing is predicting a negative outcome that is out of proportion to how much evidence I have that that negative outcome is going to happen, right? Or I'm putting a disproportionate amount of mental energy onto that catastrophic potential outcome, right? And sometimes you see a domino effect with this, right? So if I don't get enough sleep tonight, I'm going to fail the midterm tomorrow, and then I'm going to be demoralized for the final for the rest of the semester. My whole grade is going to tank. My GPA is going to drop. I'm not going to get into the internship that I wanted. And why did I do this career anyway, right? It's just like this domino effect of more negative things that are going to happen. Bandwagoning can be a little more subtle, but it's a good one to be attentive to. This is an element behind what we sometimes talk about with different mental health issues, like that can be contagious. So things like disordered eating practices or self-harming behaviors, or just homesickness can spread through a group, right? So not only behaviors can spread through a group, but also feelings like anxiety or loneliness can spread through a group, or feeling dejected, or this isn't a good idea, right? Those kinds of things can spread through a group, or just opinions, right? So this person, I've heard other people say this about this person, therefore I'm just going to go along with it as if it's true. That's a good one to be aware of in group work. Negative filtering or discounting the positive is fairly self-explanatory, right? So it's easy for me to pay attention to all the negative information that's coming in. And even if there's a positive counter example, my mind finds some reason why it doesn't count, right? I did really badly last semester. I did, got all these terrible grades. Oh, but you did really well in this one class. Oh yeah, but that's an easy class. It doesn't count, right? So it's really easy for me to just filter out any evidence to the contrary. That's a really good one to be aware of and then practice looking for evidence against, right? And this is where I also like to say it is also possible to have positive filtering and discounting the negative be an example of cognitive distortion, right? That would be toxic positivity if this were reversed. So that is also an example of a cognitive distortion, because we do want to be willing to take in appropriate levels of negative information when we're making decisions. Mind reading is a lot like catastrophizing, but this is predicting what another person is thinking outside of the amount of evidence that I have that that's actually the case, right? So I invited Sandra to my baby shower, right? I sent Sandra a text. I could see that the text was read. It was a couple of days ago. Sandra hasn't responded. Sandra hates me, right? That's a little bit of a silly example, and thank you for letting me use you as an example, Sandra. But so often we might be telling ourselves a story of why someone else is doing a certain thing, right? Why did that person cut us off in traffic? Well, that's just because that person's an a-hole and doesn't care about my feelings, right? Whatever. Again, I like to point out, like, is it possible that that's why Sandra didn't respond to my text? Like, maybe there's something that I did that I wasn't aware of, or maybe Sandra is, having a challenge with me or something like that. But again, like, what's the evidence for that being the reason? Is it possible there's another reason? Like, why am I telling myself that story? Blaming or victimizing is, again, fairly self-explanatory, but it's worth pointing out that this can go either way, right? It could be easy for me to point the finger at another person about something that I really need to take responsibility for. It could also be that it's easier for me to point the finger at myself rather than to hold somebody else accountable for their actions or for their contribution to a situation, right? And part of that could be a life skill, like that could be an assertiveness skill that could be lacking there, and maybe there's an opportunity to think through that as well. That could be a whole workshop. Magical thinking is one that's not necessarily as familiar to people, and I initially, when I started teaching thought challenging, I didn't include magical thinking. Now I'm going to introduce it here because if it's relevant to you, you're going to recognize it right away, and it's good to be aware of it in other people. Okay, so magical thinking is when your mind starts connecting events that you know rationally are unrelated, but you can't stop thinking or can't stop behaving as if there is a connection and that you need to do certain things in order to prevent other things that actually have nothing to do with each other. So I'll give an example. I worked with a young man who was maybe 14 or so at the time. And his older brother actually asked him to come and see me because his older brother noticed that this 14-year-old young man was, when he would walk into a room, he would have to touch the light switch an even number of times, right? So if he, for instance, if he touched it only once, then he had to go back and touch it again towards, as he was leaving, or even in the moment. If he walked by a fence post, he had to touch the fence post twice, right? And if he didn't, it caused him some anxiety. Now, this was relatively early on, so it wouldn't have been developed enough for some kind of diagnosis. Like if you see that kind of much later and it causes a person great distress if they don't wash their hands an even number of times, or they don't like go down the stairs while touching this railing or that kind of thing. So it wasn't quite at that point yet, but his older brother had just learned about cognitive distortions and about magical thinking and about obsessive or compulsive behavior in his psychology class in university, and he started to identify little bits of it in his younger brother. And so he was talking to his younger brother about how, like, hey, like when you get an urge to touch something an even number of times, or when you're walking down the sidewalk, that was another one for him. He was walking down the sidewalk and he could not step on a crack. If he stepped on a crack, it really bothered him. He thought he would, like, someone in his life was going to have an accident or something like that. He had to go all the way back to the start of the sidewalk and walk down again without stepping on the cracks. And his older brother was like, hey, it's not a healthy thought, and that's not a true thought. And when those kinds of thoughts occur to you, you need to practice talking back to them, right? So that they don't kind of overwhelm your life. So if you've identified magical thinking, it is a really good one to be aware of so that you can kind of catch it early. So that's my introduction to the idea of cognitive distortions. Now, if I were working with somebody, even in a kind of a first aider lens, right? From a first aider lens, that's what they're called. They're called cognitive distortions. And sometimes if you're hanging out with someone in the field, and maybe you're in a camp and you're there like for 6 months in the bush or something, sometimes people have anxiety disorders and they have already a background in CBT, and they've been working with a CBT therapist, and sometimes people are quite well versed in cognitive distortions. I know a bunch of them, and I'm prone to this and this one, and they might actually have that language already. If I were supporting Jean and this were like the first time that I were going to introduce the concept of a cognitive distortion to Jean, hey Jean, it sounds like you might be catastrophizing sometimes or whatever, I probably wouldn't use the term cognitive distortion. Any thoughts why I wouldn't use that term?
Yeah, it could seem like
Lauren?
negative connotation.
Yeah, it definitely does have a bit of a negative connotation to it, right? Like, what do you mean my thinking's distorted? Like, it can just kind of start the concept off on the wrong foot. it's also like a $20 university term, cognitive distortions, right? Like that is what it's called, but it just might not feel as accessible to use that term. So I would probably introduce the idea by saying something like, hey, Jean, sometimes when our thoughts are spiraling out of control, like we can just get caught into a thought trap or a thought spiral. I'd probably use that kind of terminology just to introduce it. But then we might talk about how like catastrophizing is a thing, right? And hey, if you're interested, we can look at kind of replacement thoughts or other ways you might challenge that thought. So for the sake of time, I'm going to put you back into breakout rooms, okay? Just same people so you get to know each other. And look at page 2. Now there's, I think, 4 different examples on page 2, and then there's a little self-reflection question at the bottom. Now, my invitation is read through all the questions together, just briefly, just so you know what they are, and then pick out, okay, what's the most interesting one to you guys? And then just pick one that's interesting, talk through it, try to identify the cognitive distortion, and what's a way you could challenge it or a healthy alternative thought. Okay, I'm going to give you 10 minutes for this, maybe even 12, because that'll let us wrap up at 12:30 or 6:30.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh, yes, sorry. Go ahead, Lauren.
Oh, sorry. Oh God, terrible timing. I was just curious about like if you start to like with the gene situation, if you start to ask to go look at like what's the evidence for and what's the evidence against, and it seems to be like agitating the person. Like, is there a certain level of like that's okay, or do you like, oh, throw that out the window and then like try something else? Because it does seem like it would be distressing to look at the evidence for, evidence against, but that it's an important part of the cognitive like challenging process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think for the sake of a shorter answer, I think I would follow like how interested is this person in this idea, right? And that is part of what we like build into the course. We talk about, well, does this person want my help, or what stage of change is this person in? In the course, we spend more time on trying to unpack that. But yeah, I'd be like, okay, does it feel interesting to you to try to unpack that thought or to unpack that negative thought spiral? Or not. And if the person's getting agitated, right, or getting anxious while you're having the conversation, I'd say, well, that person's in partial lizard brain. So if someone's in partial lizard brain, the appropriate thing to do is not to push harder with the logical, rational stuff. The appropriate thing to do is just to regulate, go back to regulation and relationship, right? And then maybe they'll be interested later. So, yeah, good question. Awkward timing, but good question. Okay, I think probably these are still open for you guys. Can you get back in your rooms now? Okay. And Sandra, if you're still there, I'm going to throw you into room 1 if that's okay. Also nice to see you.
My room's not open.
Sandy, why isn't yours open?
I was in 4.
You're in 4. Okay, I'm going to move you into 3. Don't go into 3, and then I'm going to move you back into 4. Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
Sandra, is it okay to put you in room 1? I don't remember where you were before, if you were somewhere before.
Yeah, for sure, wherever.
Okay. There you go. Okay,
Yeah.
well, welcome back, folks. I know it's that's a quick one, but I know also that last webinar was long, so I'd like to honor our East Coast folks especially too. Any thoughts on the worksheet? What was an interesting example, or what was something interesting that you talked about? Yeah, let's have time for at least a couple of thoughts, and then I have a little prize draw to wrap us up, and then we'll call it a night. But yeah, let's have a couple of reflections from the rooms.
I think it's so interesting how familiar these situations are.
Yeah, now there was actually a question that invited you to reflect on that at the bottom. Anyone want to admit that you're prone to one or more of these? I'm very good at mind reading, I'll say. Yeah, Lauren's giving me a nod. Tell me about it, Lauren. What did you recognize?
Oh gosh.
You don't have to. You don't have to, but if you'd like.
The catastrophizing.
Yeah.
When? can happen just for myself. Like that school or the like studying one, I was like, oh, I've been there. So, like, and
Yeah.
then this will happen and this will happen, and then the rest of my life will be different. And it's like,
Yeah,
oh,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks for sharing. That's a great example. Yep. Anyone else?
Really good at the discounting positives.
Discounting the positives. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Am I saying your name right? Do I remember that it's Tomas?
It's Thomas, but
It
I
is
always
Thomas.
accept Tomas because it sounds cooler.
It sounds cool, yeah. Well, anyways, good to see you. Do you recognize that
Likewise.
comes up in certain situations? I'm just curious. Like, are there patterns to like the context or the people that you're more likely to discount the positive with?
Good question. It's all a lot of that for me is around social situations. So it's a blend of like discounting the positive and mind reading
Yeah.
of like overvaluing the impact I have on social situations.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's my work. I'm now a social worker, so I think about it a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And you might identify in other people too. Cool, thanks. Anybody else?
I have a quick question, but
Lauren, yeah.
okay. Just with the like magical thinking one, which was sort of about like the scenario for like that I'm worried it must be intuition that my family is in trouble. We didn't do that scenario in the group, but I'm just curious about, yeah, if there's a different approach when it's magical thinking as opposed to something like catastrophizing because of that element of like almost like mysticism about it, where
Mhm.
yeah, so I'm curious
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
when we're people like that.
Well, okay, so I'll just reiterate that like this is a skill, the whole thought challenging skill and all the rational skills, right? The time for rational skills is not to start with them, right? Because when we start with them, we just tend to cause rifts in the relationship. So the time for rational skills is a time and place, and it's once we have a relationship established, the person's regulated, right? So the way I wrote the scenario of Jean, it's not a good time for thought challenging right then and there, right? Because I've just described that she's actively anxious as you're speaking to her, right? So it's not a good time to jump in and introduce a rational concept, partly because when we're actively anxious, we don't have full access to our wizard brain, right? We're in kind of a low-key or maybe more a threat response. So we have a relationship built, we're regulated, we already have a bigger picture of what's gone on for the person. So that's in theory why it comes after the secondary survey, which is when we try to get a bigger picture of what's been going on for the person. We've spent some time empathizing with that, right? And we have a sense that the person wants our help. So there's actually a lot of criteria that we have to kind of satisfy in order to really feel like, yeah, this is a good time to introduce thought challenging. So with the magical thinking question, again, all those conditions being satisfied, I might kind of gently kind of get curious about, hey, you know, have you ever, are you familiar at all with the concept of magical thinking? Is that something that you've heard of before? You know, sometimes it can be easy to, when we are feeling anxious, to feel like our actions or our thoughts have like a disproportionate effect on what's been going on elsewhere, right? Even if we kind of know logically that that's not the case, it can be really easy to feel like that's the case. Does that sound familiar to you? Like, would it be interesting to talk more about that, that kind of thing? And sometimes just introducing the concept or the term to somebody of magical thinking, they can be like, oh yeah, I do that, right? And that can be enough to get the conversation going. I would be mindful because I worked in a lot of cultural contexts, and so I would certainly be mindful of like, is there a cultural element to this? Is there some mysticism element to this? And just to lend a little bit of maybe context to that question, because it's a good question. Even the DSM, when the DSM is a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it comes from the American Psychiatric Association, and even in the DSM, when they're outlining things like gosh, examples aren't fully coming to mind right now. Like psychotic beliefs and psychotic disorders and other kinds of catastrophic or magical or illogical ways of thinking or perceiving the world. And one of the questions I ask is, well, is there a cultural element to this? And if something is considered normative in that culture, then it doesn't tend to qualify as a mental illness if there's a cultural context to it. So yeah, it's a good question. I'd be sensitive to it, but at the same time, even if it might have arisen, or even if it might be something that the person shares with someone else, or there's a reason that they think it historically or whatever, still, if it's causing distress to the person and it's out of proportion to reality, I might still consider introducing the concept of magical thinking and being like, hey, if this is causing you distress, and you want to challenge it, like there is a term for this, it's called magical thinking, and if it helps, we could talk about like ways that you might talk back to it or be more aware of it, right? So you got to be mindful, because especially in this program, right, this program is about mental health wilderness first aid, which is, we're intentionally helping set people up who are not therapists and are not social workers, and that's not their profession, right? This is a first aid context. So it can be helpful to keep that in mind as well, is that it may not be your role. This might be a question of like, hey, could I help you connect with somebody? I know cognitive behavior therapy, I don't know that much about it, but I know that it's really evidence-based for people with anxiety. And if you want an idea of who you could contact when you're back home, here's an idea for you, right? That kind of thing. That might be the more appropriate role. It really just depends. All of these are seeds, and I'm planting seeds and inviting you folks to go off and germinate the ones that are most interesting. Yeah. Okay, any last comments? And then I'm going to do a prize draw. Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, thanks, folks. Please feel free to be in touch if that's ever of help. Now, we have 12 people here tonight, including myself. So I'm gonna say I should drop a note into the chat about where our store is, and then you can go look at all of the fun things that we have to pick from. So we have a bunch of stickers in our store. There's a link for you in the chat. Now I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Here are some of the stickers, by the way. This is our big feelings wheel sticker. I think that's what everyone so far has picked. Rachel said she has just arrived today. Yeah, you got a couple of them. We do have a thought challenging sticker. And the reason I developed this is because I thought like, okay, how would I introduce the concept of thought challenge or cognitive distortions to someone in real life, right? And that feels maybe it's a little awkward. And I was like, well, what if we had a sticker where it could just be a conversation starter with a group, right? It's not necessarily one-on-one. When I notice someone's having a hard time, this might be like a concept that we talk about one night at a campfire or something. So anyway, we have a thought challenging sticker. It's just like all the cognitive distortions around the outside. And then there's a reminder to name it, challenge it. There's an ABC sticker. There's a couple of other fun ones. There's one on the bottom. So if your number is picked tonight, we'll go alphabetically, and then you can just pick one of the stickers on our store page. So we have, I said 11 people here, they're not including myself. So we're gonna generate a random number. Number 9. And who is number 9 alphabetically? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I believe that's Sandy. Sandy Lee. Okay, so Sandy, you can hang out and ask me, or pardon me, drop me your address and which sticker you'd like, or you can send me an email. Now, I also wanted to do one more prize draw, which is for people who have attended all of our webinars, which is kind of fun. I believe Rachel qualifies for this prize draw, and I'm sorry, I don't want to miss anyone else. Mark, do you qualify for this prize? No, you missed one or two. Anyone else that I'm missing? John, you've attended a bunch of them, but maybe not all of them. Anybody else want to correct me? You're trying to unmute here. No. Not last week, I was on vacation. Oh, okay. Well, then Rachel, you win by default. And Jazz, you've been to a bunch as well. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Anyway, Rachel, you win by default, so you're welcome to pick another sticker and let me know which one you would like. Sandra, nice to see you as well. Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks for being here. Please go have a good evening, and we'll see you probably next year. I'll do another winter webinar series. That'd be fun. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Daye. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Thomas.
Bye.
Thank you.